Husband swindles his wife, sells all her possessions, and disappears. Years later, the shocking surprise he encounters leaves him speechless. But before that, consider subscribing to the channel so we can keep sharing amazing stories. Sarah and Michael's life unfolded in a quaint suburban neighborhood, where the sun-dappled streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences. Their home, a charming two-story house with ivy climbing the brick walls, was a testament to their seemingly perfect life together. The front yard was Sarah's pride and joy, a garden she had lovingly cultivated with roses, lilies, and lavender that filled the air with a sweet, calming fragrance. Inside, the house was warm and inviting, with walls adorned with family photos and mementos from their travels. The kitchen, where Sarah spent much of her time, was the heart of the home, always filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread or simmering stew. Sarah was the embodiment of grace and kindness. Her days began early, with the first light of dawn filtering through the curtains as she quietly moved through the house, careful not to wake Michael. She would start by brewing a pot of coffee, its rich scent wafting through the rooms, mingling with the fresh morning air that drifted in through the open windows. The sunlight played on her face as she prepared breakfast, her movements smooth and practiced, a dance she had perfected over the years. "Good morning, darling," Michael would greet her, descending the stairs with that easy, charming smile that had first captivated her. He would kiss her on the cheek, his lips lingering just long enough to make her heart flutter, before taking his place at the table. Sarah would serve him with a quiet joy, basking in these moments of domestic bliss. Their conversations over breakfast were light, often filled with Michael's anecdotes from work or plans for the weekend. He would talk about the latest business deals, always confident, always assured. Sarah would listen intently, her eyes sparkling with admiration for the man she believed was her protector, her provider. But there were moments, fleeting and almost imperceptible, when Michael's gaze would drift to the window, his mind elsewhere. He would catch himself and quickly return to their conversation, but those brief lapses never escaped Sarah's notice entirely. She dismissed them as the product of stress, the demands of his job, or perhaps just the weariness that comes with time. The evenings were much the same. After a long day, they would sit together in the living room, the fireplace crackling softly in the background. Michael would often read the newspaper, occasionally sharing bits of news or commenting on the latest political developments. Sarah, nestled beside him with her knitting or a book, would feel content, her world seemingly secure in the cocoon of their home. Yet, as the flames flickered in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, there were times when Michael's expression would change. His face would become distant, almost unreadable. It was as if a shadow passed over him, darkening the warm light of their home. Sarah, ever perceptive, would notice, but Michael was adept at steering the conversation away from any probing questions. He would smile, kiss her hand, and speak of their future, of trips they would take, of plans they would make together. In bed, as Sarah drifted off to sleep, she would sometimes feel Michael's arm tighten around her, as if holding on to something slipping away. She would smile to herself, thinking it was a sign of his love, never suspecting that it was something else entirely, something that would soon unravel the life she had so carefully built. This was their life, a series of days that blended into weeks and months, filled with the ordinary and the familiar. Yet beneath this surface of contentment, there was a growing tension, like a tightly wound spring ready to snap. Sarah, in her loving naivety, never imagined that the man beside her, the one she had given her heart to, was harboring secrets that would soon tear their world apart. As the years passed, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in Michael that she couldn't quite put her finger on. It started with small things, his late arrivals from work, the way he would occasionally leave the house early in the morning without giving her a reason. These absences were always accompanied by plausible explanations: a late meeting, a sudden work trip, a visit to a friend. Michael was smooth in his reassurances, his tone always calm and convincing, but there was an undercurrent in his demeanor that Sarah couldn't ignore. She would watch him from the kitchen window as he backed out of the driveway, his figure tense behind the wheel. The car would pull away, and she would stand there for a moment longer, staring at the empty street, a knot of unease tightening in her chest. Sarah was not the type to pry, always respecting Michael's space, but the frequency of these absences began to weigh on her. The once infrequent late nights became a regular occurrence, and Michael's business trips seemed to multiply, leaving her alone in their large, now quiet house. When Michael was home, there was a subtle shift in his behavior as well. He was still affectionate, still the charming husband who would kiss her on the forehead and ask about her day, but there was a distance in his eyes, a sense that his mind was elsewhere, even as he spoke to her. Their conversations, once filled with laughter and shared dreams, began to dwindle. He would often excuse himself to his study, claiming he needed to catch up on work, and Sarah would be left alone in the living room, the ticking of the clock echoing in the quiet space. In those solitary moments, Sarah's thoughts would wander. She would think about the early days of their marriage, how inseparable they had been, how Michael had once confided in her about everything. The shift in their dynamic was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. But now, looking back, Sarah could see the widening gap between them. She would sit in their bedroom, Michael's side of the bed untouched during his frequent absences, and wonder if this was just a phase, if the pressures of his work were to blame. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing more than that, but the unease gnawed at her, growing with each passing day. Michael's phone calls also became more private. He would step outside or lower his voice whenever she entered the room, ending conversations abruptly. Once, when he left his phone on the kitchen counter, Sarah noticed a text message pop up from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat, but before she could read more, Michael had re-entered the room, scooped up his phone, and flashed her a quick smile. He was always careful, always making sure she had no reason to doubt him, but these moments, these small lapses in his otherwise impeccable facade, left Sarah feeling more isolated than ever. The changes in Michael's routine were accompanied by an inexplicable restlessness in him. He would pace the length of their living room late at night, long after Sarah had gone to bed, his silhouette casting a tall shadow on the wall. She could hear the faint creak of the floorboards as he moved, the murmur of his voice as he talked to himself, too soft for her to make out the words. When she asked him about it, he would brush it off with a laugh, saying he was just working out some ideas. But there was a tension in his voice that belied his casual tone. Despite these signs, Sarah couldn't bring herself to confront him. She was a woman of deep faith in her husband, in their love, and in the life they had built together. She wanted to believe that whatever was happening was temporary, that Michael would come back to her fully, that they would find their way back to the closeness they once shared. But the cracks in their marriage were growing, and deep down, in the quiet moments of the night, Sarah feared that something far more serious was brewing beneath the surface. And so, she waited, hoping for the best, yet dreading what her instincts whispered might be the truth. Michael's descent into deceit began subtly, a calculated maneuver that played on the trust Sarah had in him. It started with smaller, less noticeable items, things that wouldn't immediately arouse suspicion. The first to go were the antiques that adorned their living room, pieces that had been passed down through Sarah's family for generations. Michael assured her that they were being stored in a safer location, citing concerns about their value and the possibility of theft. Sarah, trusting as always, didn't question him. She simply nodded, believing that Michael had her best interests at heart. The house, with its once vibrant and warm atmosphere, slowly began to change. The walls that were once filled with carefully chosen art pieces and family photographs started to look bare. Michael had suggested redecorating, telling Sarah that a minimalist approach was more modern, more in line with current trends. He spoke with such confidence, with such an air of authority on the matter, that Sarah found herself agreeing, even though a part of her missed the warmth those items had brought to their home. Next, it was the cars. Michael convinced Sarah that they needed to downsize, that having two vehicles was unnecessary, especially since they rarely went anywhere together anymore. "It's just practical," he said one evening over dinner, his voice smooth and persuasive. "We can use the money for other things, maybe even take that trip we've always talked about." Sarah, who had noticed how distant he had become but didn't want to push him away further, agreed. She missed their long drives and the feeling of freedom they once shared, but she told herself it was for the best. Michael handled everything as he always did. He made the arrangements, signed the papers, and deposited the funds into an account that Sarah never questioned. She had access to it, of course. Michael made sure of that, but she rarely looked at it, trusting that he was managing their finances wisely. After all, he had always been the one to take care of such matters. She was more focused on their home, on making it a place of comfort and love, even as its contents slowly disappeared. The jewelry was next, though this time, Michael was more careful. Sarah's grandmother's pearls, a treasured heirloom, were the first to go. Michael told Sarah that they needed to be appraised, perhaps insured given their value. "It's just a precaution," he said with a reassuring smile, "to make sure they're safe." Sarah, who wore those pearls only on special occasions, agreed, never suspecting that she would never see them again. One by one, her other pieces vanished. Bracelets, rings, even the diamond earrings Michael had given her on their 5th anniversary. Each disappearance was accompanied by a plausible explanation, a reason that made sense in the moment. As the months went by, the house that had once been filled with warmth and history began to feel empty, almost hollow. Sarah noticed it, but every time she began to worry, Michael would calm her fears with his soothing words and gentle touch. "It's just a phase," he would say. "We're streamlining our lives, getting ready for something new." And Sarah, wanting to believe him, would let her doubts slip away, focusing instead on the hope of what was to come. But beneath this surface of calm and order, Michael was orchestrating a scheme far more sinister than Sarah could ever imagine. He was systematically stripping away everything of value, preparing for a move that would leave her with nothing. And all the while, he played the role of the loving husband, his lies woven so seamlessly into their everyday life that Sarah never saw the web tightening around her. Sarah woke up that morning to an eerie silence. The usual sounds that signaled the start of a new day, the hum of the coffee maker, the distant murmur of the television in the living room, were absent. She reached over to Michael's side of the bed, expecting to find him there, perhaps still dozing, but her hand met only the cold, empty sheets. A flicker of unease rippled through her, but she pushed it aside, telling herself that he had simply risen early. She slipped out of bed and padded across the floor, her bare feet whispering against the hardwood as she made her way downstairs. The house felt different that morning, as if it were holding its breath. The air was still, heavy with an unspoken tension. As she entered the kitchen, the first thing she noticed was the lack of Michael's usual mess. The dishes he often left in the sink were gone, the countertop was spotless, and there was no trace of the breakfast he usually made before leaving for work. "Michael?" Sarah called out, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. She waited for a response, but none came. The unease that had been simmering beneath the surface began to bubble up, making her chest tighten. She checked the living room, the study, the garage, each room more empty and sterile than the last. Panic began to set in as she moved through the house, her pace quickening with each step. It was only when she reached the front door that the full weight of her fear hit her. The door was slightly ajar, something that never happened in their orderly home. She pushed it open, stepping onto the porch, and found herself staring at an empty driveway. Michael's car, which had always been parked neatly beside hers, was gone. The stark absence of it felt like a slap in the face, a glaring sign that something was terribly wrong. Heart pounding, Sarah rushed back inside and grabbed her phone, frantically dialing Michael's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. She tried again, her hands trembling as she hit redial, but the result was the same. A cold dread began to seep into her bones as she tried his number again, and then again, each time hearing only the distant, empty voice of the voicemail. Desperation clawed at her as she began searching the house for any sign of where Michael might have gone. She checked his study, rifling through papers, opening drawers, but everything was in order, as if he had never left. She moved to their bedroom, pulling open closets, checking for his clothes, but nothing seemed out of place, until she opened the top drawer of his nightstand. There, where Michael had always kept his watch, wallet, and a few other personal items, was nothing but empty space. It was as if he had carefully, meticulously, removed all traces of himself from the house. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the full implication of what she was seeing. He hadn't just left. He had erased himself from her life. She tried calling his friends, his colleagues, anyone who might know where he was, but no one had seen or heard from him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a shell of the life they had once shared. The full impact of his disappearance began to settle over her, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. Sarah sat down on the edge of the bed, her phone slipping from her fingers as the reality of her situation began to sink in. Michael was gone. He had taken everything with him, not just the physical possessions, but the life they had built together. In that moment, The house, once a symbol of their love and life together, felt like nothing more than an empty, hollow structure. And Sarah, left behind in the silence, was left with nothing but questions and a growing sense of dread. The truth was beginning to emerge, piece by piece, in the quiet aftermath of his disappearance. But Sarah wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. In the days following Michael's disappearance, Sarah was gripped by a sense of disbelief and numbness. She moved through their once familiar home as if in a daze, her mind struggling to process the reality that he was truly gone. But as the initial shock began to wear off, a deep and gnawing sense of betrayal took its place, compelling her to search for answers, to understand what had really happened. Sarah began by retracing Michael's steps, going through every detail of their life together, every decision he had made in the months leading up to his disappearance. She started with the financial records, something she had always left in Michael's hands. As she sat at the desk in his study, the sunlight streaming through the window, Sarah logged into their bank accounts for the first time in years. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating, as if part of her still hoped that this was all a misunderstanding. But as soon as the account balances appeared on the screen, Sarah felt her heart drop into her stomach. The accounts were empty, every last dollar withdrawn. She clicked through the transactions, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the dates and amounts. Large sums transferred out over the course of weeks, all leading up to the day Michael vanished. He had left nothing behind, not even a trace of where the money had gone. Sarah's hands trembled as she continued to investigate, logging into their investment accounts, checking the mortgage, the car payments. The pattern was the same everywhere she looked: zero balances, closed accounts, properties that had been sold off without her knowledge. Even the small savings account she had kept since before their marriage, which Michael had convinced her to combine with his for simplicity, was drained. It was a chilling realization, one that sent a cold wave of dread washing over her. Michael hadn't just left. He had meticulously stripped her of everything, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a house that was no longer hers in any meaningful way. The home that had once been a sanctuary, filled with love and memories, was now just an empty shell, a stark reminder of the life that had been stolen from her. The betrayal cut deeper as Sarah began to piece together the extent of Michael's deception. She found records of the jewelry sales, the antique appraisals, even the liquidation of the retirement fund they had been building for years. Every detail of their financial life had been manipulated, every asset liquidated with a cold, calculating precision that made her question everything she had ever believed about the man she had married. In her search, Sarah came across a final devastating blow. Tucked away in a drawer of Michael's desk, hidden beneath old receipts and miscellaneous papers, was a note, brief, cold, and devoid of any emotion. It read simply, "Don't try to find me. It's over." There was no explanation, no apology, nothing to indicate why he had done this to her. Just those few words, cutting and final. As Sarah sat there staring at the note in disbelief, the full weight of what had happened began to crush her. Michael hadn't just abandoned her. He had dismantled her life piece by piece, leaving her stranded in a world that suddenly felt alien and hostile. The man she had loved and trusted more than anyone had stolen everything from her, not just her money and possessions, but her sense of security, her future, and the life they had built together. The days that followed were a blur of grief and anger, as Sarah tried to comprehend the magnitude of Michael's betrayal. She had been left with nothing, no resources, no support, and no idea of what to do next. All that remained were the shattered pieces of a life that had been built on lies, and the bitter realization that she had been deceived by the one person she had trusted most. The days following Sarah's devastating discovery were marked by a profound sense of loss and disorientation. She found herself in a world that felt unrecognizable, stripped of everything she had once known. The house, once filled with warmth and love, now felt cold and foreign, its emptiness a constant reminder of Michael's betrayal. Each corner she turned, each room she entered, was haunted by the ghosts of her past life, a life that had been shattered in an instant. With no resources and no one to turn to, Sarah was forced to confront a harsh reality. She would have to start over, completely from scratch. The thought was overwhelming, a heavy burden that pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. But beneath the grief and the anger, there was a flicker of something else, a determination that had been buried deep within her, waiting for a moment like this to emerge. One morning after another sleepless night, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't allow herself to be consumed by what had happened. She couldn't let Michael's betrayal define the rest of her life. She needed to find a way to move forward, no matter how daunting that prospect seemed. Her first step was to find a place to live. She couldn't stay in the house any longer. It was too filled with memories, too tied to a life that no longer existed. With what little money she had left, Sarah rented a small, modest apartment on the edge of town. It was nothing like the home she had shared with Michael, just a tiny space with bare walls and worn furniture. But it was hers, a place where she could begin to rebuild. Finding work proved to be the next challenge. Sarah had always been the homemaker, managing their household while Michael handled their finances. She hadn't held a job in years, and the thought of re-entering the workforce was daunting. But she knew she had no choice. She needed to support herself, to regain some semblance of control over her life. After days of searching, Sarah found a small bookstore nestled on a quiet street in town. It was a quaint, old-fashioned place, with shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with the comforting scent of paper and ink. The owner, a kindly older woman named Margaret, was sympathetic to Sarah's situation. She offered Sarah a job on the spot, sensing that this woman, despite her fragility, had a strength that could only come from surviving great pain. The work was simple, stocking shelves, helping customers find books, ringing up sales. But it was exactly what Sarah needed. The routine gave her day's structure, the quiet of the bookstore a refuge from the turmoil in her mind. Each morning, as she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she felt a small sense of peace, a break from the chaos that had consumed her life. Sarah threw herself into the work, finding solace in the rhythm of the day. She would arrive early, before the store opened, to straighten the shelves and make sure everything was in order. She learned to take pride in the small things, arranging the displays, chatting with the regular customers, discovering new books that spoke to her soul. It wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself, but it was a start. The hardest part was adjusting to the loneliness. After years of sharing her life with someone, Sarah now found herself coming home to an empty apartment, the silence often unbearable. But she learned to cope, filling the quiet with the sound of music or the murmur of a book read aloud. She began to find comfort in her own company, discovering aspects of herself that had long been overshadowed by her marriage. There were moments when the weight of it all threatened to crush her, when the memories of what she had lost would overwhelm her. But in those moments, Sarah would remind herself of the simple truth she had learned through this ordeal. She was still here, still standing, and as long as she could keep moving forward, one step at a time, there was hope for a new beginning. The years that followed Michael's disappearance were a period of profound transformation for Sarah. In the beginning, every day was a battle against the lingering pain of betrayal. The weight of what Michael had done to her threatened to consume her entirely, but Sarah refused to let it define her. Slowly, with each passing day, she began to rebuild her life, piece by piece. Her job at the bookstore became more than just a source of income. It was a sanctuary. The quiet, steady rhythm of the work allowed Sarah to heal, giving her the space to reflect on her life and rediscover parts of herself that had been buried under years of marriage. The books she once sold to others became her companions, guiding her through her darkest moments and helping her to understand that life could continue, even after such a profound loss. In time, Sarah began to form new connections. It started with Margaret, the bookstore owner who had become more than just an employer. She was a confidant, a friend. Margaret, with her gentle wisdom and unspoken understanding, was there for Sarah during her most difficult moments, offering comfort without judgment. Through Margaret, Sarah met others in the community, regular customers who came to the store not just for books, but for the warmth that Sarah had cultivated there. Sarah was hesitant at first, wary of letting people get too close. But as the months turned into years, she found herself slowly opening up. She joined a book club that met at the store, where she found herself laughing again, engaging in lively discussions about stories and characters, something she had once enjoyed so much with Michael. She also began volunteering at the local library, organizing events and reading to children, finding joy in the simple act of giving back to the community. These new friendships were a balm to her wounded soul. They were different from the relationships she had known before, simpler perhaps, but also more genuine. There was no pretense, No need to hide her pain or pretend that everything was fine. These people accepted her for who she was, scars and all, and in their company, Sarah began to feel a sense of belonging that she hadn't felt in years. As she grew more comfortable in her new life, Sarah also started to entertain thoughts of a future that didn't involve Michael. It wasn't an easy process. The memories of their time together were still sharp, the wound of his betrayal still fresh in many ways. But gradually, the idea of a life without him became less terrifying. She began to dream again, of traveling, of perhaps moving to a new city, of finding love that was true and untainted by deceit. Sarah's confidence grew with each passing year. She learned to trust her own instincts, to rely on her own strength. The woman who had once been completely dependent on her husband for financial and emotional security was gone, replaced by someone far more resilient, far more capable. She had faced the worst and come out the other side stronger than she had ever imagined possible. The silence that Michael had left in his wake no longer haunted her. Instead, it became a space where she could reflect and grow. She no longer felt the need to fill every moment with noise or activity. She was content in her own company, finding peace in the quiet moments of her day. The scars of the past were still there, of course, but they were no longer raw and painful. They had become part of her story, a testament to her survival. Sarah no longer felt defined by what had happened to her. She was no longer just the woman who had been betrayed. She was a survivor, a person who had rebuilt her life from the ground up. And in that rebuilding, she discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed, a strength that would carry her through whatever came next. It was an ordinary afternoon at the bookstore, one of those quiet days where the sun streamed through the large front windows, casting warm golden light across the shelves. Sarah was at the counter, her hands moving methodically as she arranged a stack of newly arrived books. The soft murmur of conversation from a couple of customers browsing in the back provided a comforting background hum, and for a moment, Sarah allowed herself to feel a sense of contentment, a rare but increasingly frequent occurrence. The bell above the door jingled, signaling the arrival of another customer. Sarah looked up, expecting to see one of the regulars, perhaps someone seeking a recommendation or simply looking for a quiet place to spend an hour. Instead, she found herself staring at a man who seemed out of place among the polished wood and carefully curated displays. The man who entered was a shadow of his former self. His clothes were tattered, hanging loosely on a frame that had once been strong and imposing. His hair, once neatly styled, was now disheveled and streaked with gray, and his face was gaunt, lined with deep wrinkles that spoke of hardship and despair. His eyes, once full of confidence and charm, were hollow, clouded with a weariness that came from a life lived on the margins. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized him. It was Michael. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The noise of the bookstore faded away, leaving only the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She blinked, half convinced that her eyes were deceiving her, that this couldn't possibly be the man she had once loved, the man who had betrayed her so completely. But as she looked closer, there was no mistaking it. Despite the ravages of time and whatever had happened to him since he disappeared, this was undeniably Michael. Michael's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, a flicker of recognition passed between them. He hesitated, standing awkwardly in the doorway as if unsure whether he was even welcome in this place. The confident, self-assured man who had once controlled every aspect of their life together was gone, replaced by someone who seemed lost, broken. Sarah felt a whirlwind of emotions rise within her: shock, anger, confusion, even a pang of pity. How had he ended up like this? What had happened to reduce him to such a state? But overriding all of that was the sheer disbelief that he was here, standing in front of her after all these years. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick, until finally, Michael took a step forward, his movements tentative, almost fearful. It was clear that he wasn't the same man who had walked out of her life. His shoulders were slumped, his gaze uncertain, as if he had been stripped of whatever strength he had once possessed. Sarah's grip on the counter tightened as she tried to steady herself, her mind racing to process the situation. She could feel the eyes of the other customers on them, sensing the tension in the air. But she couldn't tear her gaze away from Michael. All the questions she had buried, all the unresolved emotions she had worked so hard to manage, came rushing back to the surface. Michael opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. He swallowed hard, his eyes pleading, but Sarah remained rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to even begin to comprehend what was happening. The man who had destroyed her life was now standing before her, looking like he had been destroyed by his own actions. It was a moment Sarah never could have anticipated, a twist of fate that seemed almost too surreal to believe. And yet, there he was, Michael, the man she had once trusted more than anyone, reduced to a shell of himself, standing in the very place she had rebuilt her life. Michael stood there, his body trembling as if the weight of his own guilt was too much to bear. The silence between them stretched on, oppressive and charged with the unspoken pain of the years that had passed. Finally, he took a shuddering breath and broke the silence, his voice weak and cracked, barely above a whisper. "Sarah, I'm so sorry." The apology, simple as it was, seemed woefully inadequate for the magnitude of what he had done, but the raw emotion in his voice was undeniable. This wasn't the Michael she had known, the man who had lied, manipulated, and ultimately abandoned her. This was a broken man, a shadow of his former self, who had clearly been ravaged by whatever he had endured since he walked out of her life. Michael took another step forward, his legs unsteady, as if he might collapse at any moment. His eyes, once so full of arrogance, were now filled with tears. "I know I don't deserve it," he continued, his voice trembling, "but I have to ask. I have to beg you, please forgive me." She had imagined this moment so many times over the years, the day when he might come crawling back, asking for her forgiveness. But she had never imagined it would be like this, so raw, so real, so deeply unsettling. Michael's voice cracked as he continued, his words tumbling out in a torrent of desperation. "After I left, everything fell apart. I thought I could start over, live a life free from everything, but I was wrong, so wrong. Every decision I made after leaving you, it was like I was cursed. Nothing went right. The money disappeared faster than I could spend it. I was cheated, betrayed, until I had nothing. Just like I left you with nothing. It ate away at me piece by piece, until there was nothing left. I became a ghost wandering from place to place, always trying to outrun the mistakes I made. But I couldn't. I can't. I thought I could live without you, without the life we had. I thought I was smart, that I had it all figured out, but I was wrong. I was so wrong. And now, after all these years, I see what I lost, who I lost, and I know that it's too late, but please, Sarah, please forgive me. I don't know what else to do. I have nothing left." His eyes pleaded with her, searching her face for any sign of mercy, of hope that she might somehow find it in her heart to forgive him. But as Sarah stood there, listening to his words, watching the tears fall down his weathered face, she couldn't ignore the turmoil within her. The pain he had caused was still there, embedded deep in her soul. The years of silence, the abandonment, the betrayal, it all weighed heavily on her. And now here he was, asking for forgiveness, asking for something that was far more complex and difficult than a simple, "I'm sorry," could ever make right. Sarah felt a storm of emotions, anger, sadness, confusion, and yes, even pity. But whether she could forgive him or not, whether she could find it within herself to let go of the past, was a question she wasn't ready to answer. Not yet. The moment hung in the balance, filled with the weight of everything left unsaid, everything unresolved. Sarah stood there, her eyes fixed on Michael as his words lingered in the air. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the genuine remorse that had hollowed him out, leaving him a shell of the man he once was. But as she listened to him, recounting his downfall and begging for forgiveness, Sarah felt a complex swirl of emotions. The pain he had inflicted on her was still fresh, a wound that had never fully healed. The anger she had buried for so long simmered just beneath the surface, threatening to rise. Yet, amidst the pain and anger, there was something else, a flicker of compassion, a recognition of the broken man standing before her. She had spent years rebuilding herself from the ruins he had left behind, and in doing so, she had found a strength she never knew she had. But that strength also brought with it an understanding that Michael too had suffered, albeit by his own doing. And while she couldn't forget or fully forgive what he had done, she couldn't bring herself to be cruel. For a long moment, Sarah said nothing. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable, as if weighing his words, his remorse, and the man he had become. Michael shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed in defeat. He was prepared for her anger, for her to lash out at him, to tell him that he deserved every bit of misery he had experienced. But the words never came. Instead, Sarah let out a slow, steady breath and finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Michael," she began, choosing her words carefully, "what you did to me was unforgivable. You took everything from me, my home, my security, my trust. You left me with nothing, and I had to rebuild my life from the ground up." "But," Sarah continued, her tone softening slightly, "I won't turn my back on someone who is suffering. I see the regret in your eyes, and I can hear it in your voice. I know you've paid a heavy price for your choices, and while I can't offer you forgiveness, I can offer you help. I'll help you get back on your feet. I can't give you money, but I can point you toward resources, people who can assist you. I can help you find a shelter, a place where you can stay and get the support you need. But beyond that, Michael, I can't do more. I can't let you back into my life. Too much has happened, and I've worked too hard to move on from the pain you caused." He had hoped for more, for a chance at redemption, perhaps even reconciliation, but deep down he knew this was more than he deserved. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for not turning me away." It wasn't easy, this act of kindness toward the man who had hurt her so deeply, but she knew it was the right thing to do. She had made her peace with the past, and this was a final step in letting go of the anger and hurt that had once consumed her. Without another word, Sarah turned to the bookshelf behind her, reaching for a small notebook where she kept a list of local resources. She wrote down a few addresses and phone numbers, places she knew could offer Michael the support he needed to start over. She handed him the paper, their fingers brushing for the briefest of moments, a touch that was once so familiar, but now felt like a lifetime ago. "This is what I can offer you," she said softly. "I hope you find your way." "I will," he murmured, though whether it was a promise to her or to himself, Sarah couldn't be sure. With that, Sarah stepped back, signaling the end of the conversation. Michael nodded in understanding, clutching the paper to his chest, and slowly turned to leave. As he reached the door, he paused, looking back at her one last time, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. Sarah didn't move, her expression calm and composed, watching as he finally stepped out of the bookstore and disappeared into the world beyond. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Sarah standing in the quiet, her heart heavy, but her conscience clear. She had made her decision, and now she could continue moving forward, free from the shadows of the past. What Michael never knew, and what would have shocked him to his core, was that Sarah had managed to preserve a small part of her life that he had never touched. It was a small inheritance left to her by her grandmother, one of the few things she had kept separate, tucked away in a modest account that Michael had never been aware of. It wasn't a vast fortune, but it was enough to serve as the foundation upon which she rebuilt her life. In the immediate aftermath of Michael's betrayal, when Sarah was left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of grief, it was this small inheritance that gave her the strength to keep going. She didn't squander it or use it to drown her sorrows in material comforts. Instead, she invested it carefully, thoughtfully, in ways that would allow her to regain control over her life. First, she used a portion of it to secure the modest apartment that became her sanctuary. It wasn't much, a simple, small space, but it was hers, a place where she could begin to heal, to think, to plan her next steps. The rest, she carefully invested in a way that allowed it to grow little by little, providing her with a safety net as she ventured back into the world, finding work, and slowly rebuilding her confidence. But Sarah didn't stop there. She knew what it was like to be left with nothing, to feel utterly abandoned and without hope. And so, as her financial situation stabilized, she began to use her inheritance to help others who found themselves in similarly desperate situations. She donated to shelters for women who had been left with nothing, just as she had. She funded educational programs, offering scholarships to those who had been denied opportunities, just as she had once felt her own opportunities slipping away. Her most significant endeavor, though, was the creation of a small but impactful charity that focused on helping women rebuild their lives after domestic and financial abuse. She poured her heart into this project, working tirelessly to ensure that other women would have the support and resources she had so desperately needed when her world fell apart. The charity provided not just financial aid, but also counseling, job training, and a community of support that helped countless women find their footing again. This work brought Sarah a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving, using her pain to fuel a purpose that was greater than herself. The little inheritance, once a hidden safeguard, had grown into something powerful, something transformative. It had become the seed of a new life, not just for Sarah, but for many others who had walked similar paths. Michael, in his arrogance and selfishness, had never imagined that Sarah would have anything left after he had taken everything. But he had underestimated her resilience, her capacity to rise from the ashes and create something beautiful out of the wreckage of their past. Sarah had quietly, steadfastly rebuilt her life, not just for herself, but for others who needed it as much as she once had. And so, while Michael was left wandering, broken and lost, Sarah was leading a life of purpose and strength, far beyond anything he could have ever imagined. The small inheritance, once hidden away, had become the cornerstone of a legacy that would endure, a testament to her courage and determination. As the days turned into weeks after their encounter, Michael found himself haunted by the memory of Sarah, how she had stood before him, strong and composed, despite everything he had done to her. He wandered the streets, his mind a storm of regret and self-recrimination, unable to shake the image of her, so different from the broken woman he had expected to find. One afternoon, driven by a need to understand what had become of the life he had left behind, Michael found himself walking past the bookstore where Sarah worked. He kept his distance, staying in the shadows, but he could see her through the large glass window. She was talking to a customer, her expression warm and animated, a slight smile on her lips. There was a calmness about her, a sense of peace and purpose that radiated from her in a way that left him breathless. Michael watched as she moved about the store, helping customers, tidying shelves and chatting with her colleagues. It was clear that this place was more than just a job for her. It was a haven, a community that she had built around herself. And it was flourishing, just like Sarah. The pain of seeing her so content, so successful, cut deeper than he had imagined. It was then that he realized the full extent of what he had lost. In that moment, Michael understood that the comfortable life he had once known wasn't the real loss. The real loss was Sarah herself, the only person who had truly cared for him, who had loved him unconditionally. He had taken that love for granted, believing that he could walk away and find something better. But now, as he stood on the outside looking in, he realized that there had never been anything better than what he had with Sarah. She had moved on, not just surviving but thriving, creating a life of meaning and fulfillment without him. And Michael, who had thought himself so clever, so capable of building a new life on his own terms, was left with nothing but the bitter taste of regret. He had lost not just a partner, but a person of incredible strength and resilience, someone who had transformed the pain he inflicted into something beautiful. Sarah, meanwhile, had found a sense of closure. Offering Michael help, while refusing to let him back into her life, had been the final step in her healing process. She had forgiven him, not to absolve him of his actions, but to free herself from the hold that his betrayal had once had over her. In forgiving him, she had reclaimed her power, ensuring that he could no longer control any part of her life. As Michael walked away from the bookstore for the last time, he was overwhelmed by a profound sense of emptiness. The realization that he had been the architect of his own downfall was inescapable. The life he had so carelessly thrown away could never be recovered, and the love he had taken for granted was lost to him forever. But for Sarah, the future was bright. She had emerged from the darkness stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to live a life of purpose. She had built something beautiful from the ashes of her past, and in doing so, had found peace. The forgiveness she had extended to Michael was not a gift to him, but a gift to herself. A final act of closure that allowed her to step fully into the next chapter of her life, free from the shadows of her past.